So, Exodus, a long history. The concept of Exodus is an exemplary concept in political narratives and in poetic passages of liberation. It's an essentially contested concept, or as I prefer, a constantly contested concept to avoid any misunderstanding that my aim is to secure for the concept a fixed or final essence. Constant contestation, agonism, picks up on the concept's resistance to having its meaning closed down through conceits of divine determination or dogmatic specification. Concepts are not interpreted but for interpretation, not adapted but for adaptation. Claims on the Exodus concept are typically made by select, self-selecting, chosen or self-chosen groups that because of religion, race, or social standing seek their liberation from tyrannies, barbarisms, and oppressions. From the Greek Exodus is everything okay?
Yeah, everything's fine.
Okay, so I can hear this echo chorus and know it. From the Greek, Exodus stands for a going out, a moving away, a going forth that marks a new life, but not immediately or automatically a free life completed or achieved. The concept stands for an exit that promises a new start, a chance to live in freedom without a guarantee that things will work out as expected. The Exodus stands, as I like to say, for a preparation for, or even as a prelude to, freedom. But as such, a space is left open for the promise of the Exodus to be broken or for the concept to be abused. Well, I had wanted to play, it's not working.
Of course.
It's okay. I just had lovely clips to show you, movies, old films, songs. Wanted to cheer you up at this point in the morning. Oh, well, I'll talk, and then when it happens, it happens. The concept stands more for a leaving behind than an arriving, more a new start than an ending. The end, or telos, of Exodus is the promised land, in shaping the beginning of a long passage toward that land, lasting 40 or more years. The telos has been the not yet in many teleological philosophies of history, the noch nicht that one historian has associated with an infectious contagion for liberty. One catches or becomes intoxicated by the spirit of Exodus to bury, indeed to forget, the dark times of persecution and suffering. The Exodus concept is a cluster and clustering concept, meaning that it can't be tracked without reference to other concepts of blessing and cursing, servitude and deliverance, mass exile and genocide, slave and free labor, suffering and sacrifice. At its core, it's been used to challenge established values and habitual beliefs. To really see the concept at work, it must be tracked not in the air, in the rarefied abstractions of theory, but in the weeds, the water, and the wilderness, where habits and expectations are, while most challenged, hardest to break. In the thick of things, we see the concept's promise of liberation, but its failure easily to deliver people into the freedom they want. For what people want isn't always what they need. Escaping one sort of oppression doesn't mean escaping all oppression, which is why freed peoples sometimes become oppressors themselves, or why oppressive tendencies remain within people as internalized in their desires and beliefs, even when the external chains of bondage have been cut. To associate the Exodus concept with a new start fits dynamic typological histories of adaptation and appropriation. In such histories, particularities of events and specificities of people tend to be absorbed into universalizing claims about human life tout court, that life is a constant leaving behind of error, falsehood, or biblically speaking, of sin. This way, specifications are erased to suit typological and allegorical narratives of prefiguration and refiguration, or, beyond denoting a one-time event, Exodus comes to symbolize a repeatable event, a promise renewable for each and every generation. When the first leader of the Exodus was named Moses, he was generically named as the man, Moses. The figure and the name came as a cluster and clustering term to stand for less a set of personal characteristics than a set and a conflicted set of adaptable characteristics, so that if and when one leader did not enter the promised land, another could take his place. From the so named first Moses followed the second or new Moses, but never a third or fourth, but always only the second or new Moses, born and reborn over and over again, without exception, it seems, into male bodies. Joshua, Jesus, Muhammad, Paul, on and on through histories of kings and emperors, reaching most recently Mandela and Martin Luther King. I would have loved...
Where is it? It is.
Yeah, I can see it. Okay, good. There, well, there's a nice Rembrandt picture. Each leader, but the first Moses most of all, was made to fall under different descriptions, even tempting some interpreters to split his figure into two, to bring attention to the difficulties of being a leader who was not the maker, but only the all-too-human deliverer of the divine law. Divested of power unto personal and agency, the first Moses was figured to show just how difficult a matter was the promise of freedom, let alone freedom's achievement. Moses was made himself to travel with conviction and doubt, willingness and resistance, arrogance and humility, violence and peacefulness, and with a tongue that could sometimes speak and at other times not speak at all the while working out how best to prepare his people for freedom. If Moses as a clustered figure could be substituted by other individuals into history in these teleological and typological narratives, so too could cities be refigured when Jerusalem became the New Jerusalem everywhere. In Italy, the Netherlands, England, France, and of course in America in 1776, as shown in the Great Seal designed at the moment of declaring America's independence. And so similarly regarding the figure of the oppressing Egyptian named the Pharaoh. For sometimes he was seen as drowning alongside his host, his soldiers, horses, and chariots in the Red Sea, but other times he was pictured as saved so as to witness the loss of his power and the total downfall of his kingdom. Here a really interesting complexity arises that even in the not so late, quite very early on, really anti-Jewish constructions of Exodus, when Moses and his people were said to leave Egypt, not because they were oppressed, but because they carried the plague of leprous spots. The Pharaoh was not then refigured so as to be seen no longer as an oppressor. Instead, in this history, the Israelites were joined, conflated and confused with the Egyptians in an overwhelming anti-Semitic, in the broadest sense, an anti-Semitic narrative, as though to say that it would have been preferable for future generations had the entire waste of Jews and Egyptians been buried alike in the mud of the Red Sea. To tell the history of the Exodus concept by reference to its typology is to start at the beginning, when the title of the biblical book, first given as names, Shemot, is that right? Shemot, good, was then retitled as Exodus, but thereby somewhat disguising the continuity of the second book with the first, the book of Genesis, where naming and legitimate heritage or belonging was the main matter. To reveal the continuity between the Genesis and Exodus concepts is important, not least because it draws us back to the original Canaanite myth that saw the passage over the Red Sea to be a replay of the primordial act of creation. figured as a primordial dragon of chaos, the pharaoh figure had to be defeated by a figure of law and order if the human and cosmological worlds could properly, divinely, be said to begin. The continuity between the Genesis and Exodus concepts was further rationalized through the belief that what the passages of creation and of crossing were about was the generating and regenerating of families, peoples, and nations, or families of nations. But here it was less the leader who drew the bloodlines through the families, for the leader could always be replaced. What counted much more was the making of families, peoples, and nations. It was they who had to prepare themselves for freedom, whoever the leader. And then it's sometimes said, apparently, though I'm no expert, that in the Passover story, I mean, I am Jewish, but I don't know the Passover story so well, but that Moses is hardly ever actually named. And this is a very interesting thing, apparently. So the relation between peoples and nations seeking and establishing lawfulness resisted a political and theological history of absolute authority being placed into the hands of a leader, a single figure. Hence, the night before his assassination, Martin Luther King addressed his people by saying, like anybody, I'd like to live a long life. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. In opening his book on Exodus and Revolution, Michael Walzer writes with striking exaggeration, I found the Exodus almost everywhere, though everywhere is often limited by an eye that looks only to the narratives of so-called Western nations and cultures. He doesn't really look everywhere. What Walzer writes of the Exodus narrative as deriving its strength from the promise given at its very start, although he stresses what he takes to be the crucial and though obvious point that what is promised is radically different from what is. He says the end is nothing like the beginning. He then distinguishes the Exodus narrative from those ancient tales of voyages and journeys to which he says, still with his exaggeration, they bear no resemblance. For whatever the adventures of in Homer and the Iliad and so on, they begin and end at home. The claim of no resemblance between such narratives and the Exodus is obviously too strong, given the complexity of the very idea of home. For being at home is not necessarily to feel at home, or when arriving somewhere new, people tend to take their homely habits with them, or in returning home, something must have changed, for otherwise there'd been little point in taking the journey. In Dante's Purgatorio, in the canto Singing for the Crowd of Souls, it's written that they all sang in together with one voice of the exit to Israel from Egypt. Following their song, they saw the sign of the sacred cross, the Christian one, and flung themselves toward it on the shore, but at this moment the sign of the cross disappeared, leaving them estranged. They said they felt unfamiliar in this new place. Looking around, they experienced something quite new. Now, Cynthia Ozick has focused on just the estrangement in the Exodus concept. 400 years of bondage in Egypt, she writes, may be rendered as metaphoric memory, spoken in a moment, in a single sentence. What the sentence is, she continues, is we all know. We have built every idea of moral civilization on it. It's a sentence that conceivably sums up the start of every revelation that came afterward. Here's the sentence. The stranger that sojourneth with you shall be unto you as the homeborn among you, and you shall love him as yourself, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. To describe the Israelites as strangers in Egypt ignores the continuation of their estrangement following their liberation from oppression. The Exodus concept marks a first exit, a first glimpse of freedom, but then the new passage of promise in a wilderness in which one works out what freedom means under a condition of estrangement. So hard a task, wrote Virgil, was it to found Rome, and though the Roman Empire found its order, it soon fell into confusion. Now, I've been teaching Lit Hum this semester and have found all the core books, of course, to be contributions to the history of Exodus and exile, to memory and metaphor. But I'm really invested in the estrangement that remains in the Exodus concept following the liberation from servitude, because the Hebrew term for stranger, Goehr, is what gives my own family its name. I am called Goehr. I can't help it. So, now I recently had an opportunity to deliver a keynote talk where finding the key was my theme. I found the key in a tradition of rhetoric to which both Moses and Socrates, under the description of the Athenian stranger, contributed, when they turned their words to what it meant first for slaves and then for free persons to accept the laws of a state. Their starting problem was their awareness that laws in a free state are necessarily restricted, all those thou shalt nots of the commandments. How, they asked, could one prepare or prelude persons into accepting restrictions under the condition of freedom? How could individuals come to recognize that limits on their personal freedoms were necessary for the good of the state? Or how could a freedom from turn into a freedom to if one's appetites or one's will still felt restricted? So hard a task was freedom that it led freed peoples to wonder whether their servitude had not better suited their wants. Or, as it's also been said, freedom doesn't yield, despite the headlines, all the milk and honey that's promised. The wilderness implicit in the Exodus concept has been construed as a space and time of radical doubt, an emptiness, a loss, even a nothing. Sometimes the escaping from oppression so absorbs the consciousness of a people that when free, they're left simply asking, was nun? What now? And the answer is that the now of that moment of freedom is when all the hard work begins. The Exodus concept is about choice and constant choice, but choice isn't an easy affair. Running through it a history of use and abuse, the concept of Exodus has shown how, given choices or selections made, that the truth is that for one people to be deliberated means that another has to be drowned. The concept has patented and almost been patented to show how unjust oppression is met with righteous revenge. Yet in this pattern, a tragic chord has always been played out whenever it was forgotten in the Song of Praise that the freedom for some meant the violent death for others. Even Yahweh had to remind the Israelites that the Egyptians drowned beneath the Red Sea were and must be of his creation too, for he was the only God and therefore the only creator. The idea that freedom from means also destruction of has been evidenced in all kinds of dialectical arguments of the Exodus, and also in a dialectical art where songs and paintings of the Exodus have been doubly titled The Liberation of the Israelites or The Destruction of the Pharaoh's Host, as though one title couldn't survive without the other. The Exodus concept has also been put to work in treatises of freedom and law, of course, and in poetry, myth, and song. In evidence here are dialectical and often devastating passages of civilization and enlightenment. Here we may speak of the Exodus concept as evidenced in what Walter Benjamin termed Denkbilder, compressions or constellations of a clustered and clustering concept into single lines, images, parables, and even anecdotes. Cynthia Ozick chose her line to capture the history of Exodus, but there are other lines too. One line very often sung at the start of most oratorios sings, "But oh, what wonders did the Lord at the Red Sea to us afford. He made our passage on dry ground while Pharaoh and his host were drowned." Even it rhymes, the grounding and the drowning. So here the Pharaoh was said explicitly to have met his end in the Red Sea. Or here's the line associated more with the figure of Miriam than of Moses. "Sing unto Yahweh, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its chariot has he thrown into the sea." And I just, if I can, wanted to play you a clip from a Handel oratorio, and it's conducted by my grandfather, who did the first recording in 1950 or so. No. But I don't know whether we'll get it. It's good. It's very silent. I have no idea. Well, you know how Handel goes. I can.
Is this it? Is that the right thing?
Yeah. I hid the image because it said Adonai, and I didn't think you were allowed to show it, so I hid it. Okay, well, you know how Handel sounds. Okay, so the interesting thing about Miriam's line, "Sing unto Yahweh, for he's highly exalted, the horse and its chariot has he thrown into the sea." This line has been actually evidenced mostly as showing the role of women at last in early musical practices, and even as claiming a certain origin for music, given the belief that the Red Sea contained all the shells from which first musical instruments were made. It's a little odd when you get to think about David in the Old Testament, but don't worry about that. Now, later in the history, I also wanted to play you, we hear Edith Piaf dedicating a song of Exodus to the founding of a peaceful Jewish state. And later, of course, I wanted to play you Bob Marley, questioning his generation. "Tell me why, having trod through great tribulation, we have not yet moved. Open your eyes and look within. Are you satisfied with the life you're living?" Let me see if I press anything now. Oh, well, I'm going to leave you just with the fact. Okay, you can keep reading that. This is my last paragraph. As a critical theorist, I study the arts and aesthetic theory to expose the use and abuse of concepts in the typological and teleological narratives that have dominated politics and social theory. I'm presently completing a book on the Exodus concept as it's been put to work in a single anecdote that tells of a painter who, having meant to paint the Red Sea passage, painted an entire wall red, and when asked to explain, said, "Well, the Israelites have already crossed, and the Egyptians are drowned." This anecdote was included by Kierkegaard in the Psalmic passages that open his Either-Or, and reused by Arthur Danto to open his transfiguration of the commonplace. But much more intriguingly, and with some disguise, it was also used to open Puccini's opera, La Boheme. Why in the opera the poet had to drown the pharaoh with red paint to get the drama going was what inspired me to ask what the Red Sea passage could possibly have to do with the concept of Boheme. And 600 pages now compressed into one-line answer, what I found was that for the Boheme concept to become a concept for the lives of artists and writers in post-revolutionary France, it was deemed necessary to wipe out all the waste for which the concept had previously stood. And that waste included the entire waste of humanity, the so-called Jews, Egyptians, as the originating term for the gypsies, all of whom had traveled as dispersed peoples, they said, from the Red Sea to the modern capital cities of Europe. When Karl Marx was thinking about the conditions that would lead to a true revolution, in part he looked to America to congratulate Lincoln and the northern states for abolishing slavery. The Red Sea of civil war, he wrote, has swept away the barrier that hindered revolutionary progress. But when, 10 years earlier, in looking at what needed to be swept away in Europe, he looked specifically to Paris, where he found less oppressed workers than what he listed as vagabonds, discharged soldiers and jailbirds, galley slaves, swindlers, mountebanks, lazzaroni, pickpockets, tricksters, gamblers, pimps, brothel keepers, porters, organ grinders, rag pickers, knife grinders, tinkers, and beggars, and then he included the literati. In short, he included that whole indeterminate, disintegrated, fluctuating mass that the French call la Boheme. In my book, I've tracked the Exodus concept running through the history of Boheme in terms of promises of liberation that did not turn out at all as expected, which is why today I've stressed the promissory character of the Exodus concept, the possibility, the preparation, the preluding toward freedom. To mark the death of Moses, it was written in Deuteronomy, "This is the land I swore to Abraham and give to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not get there." The Exodus concept asks us to consider the conditions of labor as a preparation for freedom. The concept of Exodus is most abused, however, when words of labor and freedom, Arbeit and Freiheit, are placed on gates of entry to a new place where death is the only reality, a death parading as life. Thank you.
I had this idea when I was invited, and thank you very much, Stasis, for inviting me, that I would somehow end up reaching in the bag for some innocuous, trivial-sounding factoid, some manifestly apolitical, even anti-political, non-conceptual, anti-conceptual, empiricists, that of garbage, and would perform some kind of alchemy to demonstrate that it's not only a concept, that it's doing intelligent work, but also that it's a properly political concept, that it's doing relevant work, and moreover that it's a politically proper or politically palatable, or what one might even say politically correct concept, that it's doing good work, advancing a cause, engaging with oppression, contributing to emancipation. To extract a concept, any concept, from a morass of blind intuitions might even in itself, on some reading, be regarded as a kind of political intervention, or at least a historical one, in that it might provide us with a glimmer of direction and agency in the face of what might otherwise mesmerize us with its stupid immediacy or coercive facticity. Instead of doing that, moving in that direction, I feel as if I've done just the opposite. Taking the obvious route, I grabbed at a perfectly worthy, vibrantly activist-sounding, emphatically political concept, resistance, and kind of wrecked it, casting doubts on whether it's really a concept or really political, or in any case, whether it's politically useful, attractive, or even bearable. Is resistance a good political concept? Does it make for good politics? Is it a concept? Does it have the coherence and consistency of a concept in the first place? My ultimate intention is to show that it is all three of these things, but for unexpected and perhaps troubling, and certainly roundabout reasons. There's an antinomy implicit in the word itself. Resistance signals both impediment and impetus. It can either disrupt or sustain the equilibrium and steadiness of every state of affairs or setup, either a force of transformation or a bulwark against innovation, either conservative or transformative, and at times, disconcertingly, both at once. Resistance shares many of the semantic tensions of its close cognate, stasis, with its contradictory senses of immobility and upheaval. Stasis, in ancient Greek, probably modern too, has the ambiguity relating to all things standing. Both resistance and stasis derive from histemi, from which the Latin stare, sistera, from which also eventually existere, to step out into being, to stand forth, to exist, in short. A verb that pivots on the grammatical tension between its stative and its dynamic usage, between the condition of standing and the act of standing up, between situation and event. So, steadfastness, constancy, and stability on the one hand, interruption, instigation, initiation on the other. It points to that which is stationary, static, persists, which stands up over time, which withstands the corrosive and erosive forces of antagonism and entropy, which is consecrated to status, consistency, and standing. For example, the installation of a statue, the establishment of an institution, constitution, legal statute, or sovereign state. And the state, like every institution, is tautologically bound to its own status, that is, stability. But it also gestures to that which insists, which takes a stand, stands apart from or against, stands up to, rises up against the existing state of affairs, defies the status quo, desists from consensus, dismantles statues and institutions, defies laws and constitutions, introduces dissent, division, discord into the stable order of the state as such. Stasis thus means steadiness, constancy, permanence, and it also means sedition, faction, rebellion, civil war. There's thus an internal dissensus or stasis in the very meaning of stasis. Nicole Leroux, who's done more than anyone to explore this antinomy, speaks of a Gegensinn, alluding to those, contradictory meaning, alluding to those primal words that Freud loved to draw on when demonstrating the imperviousness of the unconscious to the law of non-contradiction. Barbara Cassin finds the word Freudian Hegelian, which immediately raises the stakes. It resembles those special words Hegel enjoyed stumbling on in his own mother tongue, words like Aufhebung, notably, with its antithetical and diverse range of meanings, and that he took, Hegel, as evidence of the pulsating negativity of thought and being. Stasis forces us to reconsider the opposition of motion and rest. It puts the very antithesis of stasis and kinesis into question. Too much stability can be destabilizing, while excessive mobility produces deadlock. In a medical register, in our language too, stasis refers to digestive sluggishness, circulatory constriction, gastric blockage, constipation, the toxic coagulation or clogging of bodily humors, a stagnation that will eventually throw the whole organism into crisis. In a political register, stasis is a kind of hardening or rigidity that can precipitate upheaval precisely because in its obduracy, its one-sidedness, its refusal to adapt to circumstances, to go with the flow, it exposes the rigid armature sustaining the status quo, provoking violent counterreactions, and thus forcing latent antagonisms to the surface. We are in a state when our confinement, our stuckness, becomes explosive. Conversely, too much agitation can be immobilizing. The 6th century poet Alcaeus speaks of a stasis of the winds as when a ship, a sailing vessel, a ship of state, is caught between countervailing gusts, buffeted from one side to another, marooned in constant motion as if becalmed. We are at sea when too much turbulence becomes constricting, when we become immobilized by internal conflict or trapped in the ceaseless vortex of opposing forces. This also happens in a political register when protracted conflict can produce oppositional gridlock, the stalemate of prolonged civil war, the repetitive circle of revenge, the collapse of time and history into an endless cycling and recycling of provocation and reprisal. This historical paralysis can leave as its legacy yet another blockage. The future dissipates before the traumatic persistence of a past that will not pass, but which lingers on as a stony impediment, arresting both thought and action. This is why stasis for the Greeks, for the ancient Greeks, the civil war at Athens, for example, when the unified city found itself convulsed by internal dissension, at once paralyzed by strife and spinning out of control, simultaneously agitated and frozen, why stasis poses such a problem for the reestablishment of subsequent rule and the return to history. It also poses a fundamental problem for the archive. Nothing short of enforced amnesia, an indelibly inscribed erasure, could break the traumatic hold of the past and suspend the deadlock of inter- and transgenerational violence. This amnesia often took a paradoxical form, legally mandated forgetfulness, the paradoxical injunction not to remember, to take an oath, to make a promise, committing oneself not to remember. That is, to remember not to remember, or more accurately, to remember to not remember. They're not quite the same. The official oblivion, I'm referring to the official oblivion decreed by the law of amnesty of 403 BCE, which will be the blueprint for so many subsequent amnesties, from the Edict of Nantes through the Treaty of Westphalia to the post-war legislation in France, forbidding the prosecution or even the naming of collaborators in the Vichy regime. But amnesty is itself a kind of freeze, stasis supervening upon a previous stasis, a kind of shock administered to a quiet shock, but nonetheless a shock, administered to an inert or emptily gyrating body politic. Everything is arrested, everything starts up again. History is resumed, but only after a kind of deep freeze, a sudden standstill that interrupts stagnation precisely by repeating or intensifying it. Resistance is a kind of primal word in just this sense. An oppositional and repetitive stance and standing, there's an against lurking in every against. Resistance straddles the line between persistence and insistence. Resistance points at once to a kind of conservatism, a reluctance, inertia, and even paralysis, and to a restlessness that needs to push every situation to breaking point and to leave nothing standing. The point is not that resistance is ideologically amorphous or that it inherently lacks political motivation, as is often charged. But there's a fundamental instability in the concept that makes it both intriguing and awkward as a political resource. Although it's always tempting to think of resistance as a good thing, defiance takes courage, and we want to think that this courage must place it squarely on the side of liberty and justice, it can be sobering to recall that its earliest expressions tilted decidedly toward the right. Think of Edmund Burke, think of La Vendée, think of Clausewitz. Everyone wants to claim it, and everyone needs to deflate it. There are some uncomfortable historical issues. One need look no further than to the mother of all resistances, the movement that claimed the name as its very own, the resistance, la résistance, to see how quickly the waters become murky. The point is not simply that the extent of the French resistance turned out to have been woefully exaggerated, that, like any other historical event, it so quickly came to be overtaken by myth and fantasy, and that the line between resistance and collaboration could, in hindsight, start to look blurry sometimes. I'm referring to the so-called Vichy syndrome that shook France in the 1970s and has never really stopped shaking it. The resistance was fraught with political tensions from the outset, and its legacy remains painfully divided. The patriotic sentiments inflamed by the French resistance to the German occupation would be harnessed by de Gaulle almost immediately after the war to refuel France's own war of colonial aggression in North Africa. And these nationalist sentiments would eventually be harnessed by far more virulent forces than de Gaulle's. A violence that would in turn help spur the Algerian War of Independence with its own vicissitudes and vengeful aftermath. These historical details are engrossing, but it's the structural issue that I want to be engaging here. It's become a little routine to disparage resistance, to doubt its efficacy, or to deplore its reactive and even reactionary aspects. This deflationary project can often be an exercise in Schadenfreude, and so I suppose pointing this out. A cursory reading of Adorno, Foucault, Gambon, Arendt, Hart-Negri, or Zizek might suggest that resistance is futile, that it's co-opted in advance, that it's toxically contaminated by what it opposes, it's a byproduct and accomplice of power, it's been snuffed out by the forces of total domination, ensnared in the web of administration, devoured by this thing called empire, or absorbed like oil in the machinery of global capitalism. The gist of all these arguments, of course the details are entirely diverse, suggests that hegemonic power not only accommodates, but even demands resistance. Every regime requires for its own maintenance a reliable reserve of thuggish negativity to absorb or overcome. Capitalism's need for crisis, liberal democracies' need for at least a show of contestation in order to prove the capaciousness and resilience of the system, the so-called totalitarian need for a steady supply of dissidents that it can scarily suppress by a show of force. Resistance thus seems to be parasitical on what it opposes. This is still me speaking by way of free and direct discourse, by the way. It's caught up in the repetitive vortex of action and reaction, position and opposition, the circle of reciprocal solicitation explored by Hegel in the second book of the Logic. Or, to speak in a Lacanian Nietzschean register, resistance is frozen in the imaginary. Mesmerized by its antithesis, it's condemned to the slave regime of reactivity and ressentiment. In its desire to challenge existing conditions, but without the means or will to overcome these, resistance is committed to reproducing these conditions, borrowing its energy, tactics, and even objectives from extant social models. Either every image of the future is forged in the crucible of the present, which is just the standard Marxist argument against utopian socialism, of course, or there can be no vision of the future, not even an aspiration to have one, because every future will have collapsed into the orbit of the eternal present. Resistance, as its suffix, uns, suggests, intransitive, uninflected, sheer participial endurance, is always on the verge of becoming formalistic, autotelic, self-regarding, dedicated solely to its own perpetuation. This feeds the Leninist argument against so-called left-wing communism as an infantile, that is to say, narcissistic or auto-affective disorder. But there are decidedly non-Leninist variants of the same reproach. We heard it expressed from all sides of the political spectrum during the not so long ago days of Occupy. The problem can haunt any form of activism. You can get so captivated by the struggle that you never want it to end. This was also Hegel's critique of abstract negation. The problem is not that it's too radical, too negative, but that it's reactionary. Like all skepticism of the less than thoroughgoing kind, it invests everything in its own powers of contestation, in this way conveniently obscuring its own unwavering attachment to the status quo. In short, I'm still in free and direct mode here, the negativity of resistance is either too determinate, too parochial or local in its investments, or too abstract, or rather, its own determinacy itself is an abstraction. Determinate negation is reduced to the endlessly reversible polarities of opposition and antithesis, the slave logic of reactivity and revolt. This ambiguity can contribute to the discomfort that so often arises when overtly emancipatory political projects, feminism or anti-colonialism, for example, come into contact with a project like psychoanalysis. A disruptive and even revolutionary concept of resistance as a practice of insubordination confronts a seemingly regressive and even repressive concept of resistance as a technique of self-subjugation. Resistance can thus be either a struggle against or a secret collusion with domination, either a challenge to oppression or an instrument of repression. It can be either a pressure to change or a stubborn investment in not doing so. At times, irritatingly, it can seem to be both at once, simultaneously the opening and the greatest obstacle to transformation. And in the time that remains, I want to think about this irritating simultaneity. In the interpretation of dreams, Freud defines resistance capaciously as, I'm quoting, anything that interrupts the progress of analysis. This is Strachey's translation. Was immer die Fortsetzung der Arbeit stört, ist ein Widerstand. So more precisely translated, whatever impedes the work from proceeding, from keeping on going, is a resistance. Freud sets the bar pretty low. To talk teleologically of thwarted progress, to set the terms of productivity, or even to define the goal or direction of the cure is already to beg the question. Freud is talking here about the bare minimum of momentum in an almost Beckettian sense, fortleben, keeping on going, going onwards, going forth or further. It's uncertain whether we can even say going forward. Resistance is what breaks the rhythm of what Freud will continue to the end to call the work, the repetitive accumulating scansion from month to month, from session to session, from moment to moment, from word to word. Whatever interrupts or impedes my retranslation, the continuation, the going on of work is a resistance, which of course pretty well covers everything. Missed appointments, wasted appointments, forgetting between appointments, stalling over procedure, complaining about the schedule or the fees or the furniture, obstinate stupidity, excessive knowingness, quibbling over interpretations, acquiescing too readily to interpretations in an attempt to forestall discussion, assenting to interpretations while remaining stupidly impervious to their implications, preempting the analyst's interpretations by coming up with them first, cheating analysis by showing that you can do it on your own, over-preparing for sessions, diluting the analysis by talking about it all the time with your friends and family, shadowboxing over theoretical minutiae in order to prove your intellectual acuity, refusing to get better in order to demonstrate the analyst's incompetence, getting better too quickly so as to prove his absolute redundancy, clinging to symptoms in order to display the moral profundity of your suffering, to torment the analyst by obliging them to witness the carnage, or simply to get out of doing the dishes, miraculously shedding these symptoms so you get to go home earlier. The longer, much longer paper from which this has been ripped off actually has about 15 more pages in this vein, which I will spare you. Resistance is the stagnant dead time accumulating between and within sessions, the Sisyphean cycle of obstinate regressions, false remissions, idle precipitations, the repetitive recycling of the same material, boring both the analyst and yourself with endless reiterations of the same complaint, or fascinating the analyst and yourself with manic efforts to fill the time with entertaining anecdotes, interesting theories, or penetrating observations. It's about the breakdown or atomization of time, unmodified by intervening history, removed from circulation. The past intrudes as a static, isolated remnant, unconscious repetition takes the place of conscious memory and the present evaporates from view. Or, what might amount to the same, it's the present that impinges. Everything is happening here and now, as if there were nothing and no one outside the room, no time outside the session, only an infinitely dilating now, mirage of pure temporal immediacy, inoculated from every context, untrammeled by antecedent or aftermath, expanding infinitely to fill all time. All those examples earlier were more or less drawn, with a little bit of embellishment, from Freud's own case histories, from Dora's spirited defiance to Wolfman's lusterless compliance. My point in producing that laundry list was simply to underline the protean versatility of resistance, its indefatigable inventiveness as it keeps shuffling unpredictably from negation to position, from affirmation to refusal, until the very distinction between these becomes unclear. Every denial can mask an affirmation, every acquiescence can harbor a sly repudiation. The apparent comedy of the exercise shouldn't blind us to the seriousness of the stakes. That's a lot of work to get out of work, and a lot of energy and ingenuity invested in prolonging suffering. The inventory actually doesn't begin to exhaust the repertoire of evasions, obfuscations, and prevarications that block the pathway of associations and interrupt the momentum of what Freud will continue to the end to call the analytic work. At the end of his essay, Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety, Freud tries to classify the resistances topographically with a view to dividing and conquering. As has been often noted by everybody, his whole vocabulary is military, imperial, conquistadorial from start to finish. As his catalog accumulates, however, the obstacles take on increasingly molecular dimensions, becoming protean and directionless, and the prospects of mounting a successful counter-resistance seem to dwindle. There are the explicit refusals of the ego as an agency motivated by strategic considerations of self-defense, the reality-driven need to maintain repression at all costs, the inhibiting and distracting effects of the transference, the almost prudential investment in the secondary gains of illness itself. Then there's the purposeless obstinacy of the id and its fixity and incorrigibility. It's hardwired to last. Structurally impervious to modification, indifferent to contradiction, the unconscious is the embodiment of motiveless intransigence in its purest form, timeless, as Freud calls it, in its indifference to progress, to the sequential order of before and after, cause and effect, ground and consequent, and as such, invulnerable to argument, induction, training, or habituation. And finally, most unfathomably and intractably, there's the grinding ferocity of a superego hell-bent on ruining everything, ripping up achievements, undoing progress, undermining therapeutic alliances, administering punishment, not so much for the purpose of discharging guilt as retaliation, as deterrent, or for any other remotely instrumental purpose, but for the sole purpose of provoking more guilt, Kafka style, that is, as a pretext for administering even more punishment, prolonging illness for the sole purpose of prolonging illness, no special benefits attached, a kind of pure, disinterested unpleasure in a quasi-Kantian sense. To speak by way of determinate negation of displeasure or Unlust, with its sublime promise of moral profit, is quite possibly, probably, to assume too much. Analysis will eventually, therefore, come to circle around a core of purposeless suffering, a suffering that will eventually shed the last veneer of rationality, functionality, or sacrificial payoff, and that will prolong itself for the sake of prolongation itself. A strange conatus devoid of teleology or destination. Freud is, of course, referring to the death drive. Depending on how you're counting, this might add up to 5 different species of resistance. But the categories have by now broken down. Everything is pulverized by repetition, which means there's no clear way to determine the motivation for any particular resistance, or even that it makes sense to speak of motivation at all. This also means, and here we're coming to the most difficult kernel of all, that the cruelty, the so-called cruelty of the death drive, must be considered in its most formal, unembellished abstractness, prior to any specific tendency to aggression, untethered from any sadistic libidinal investments, withdrawn from visibility, silently diffusing itself, unbound from the pleasure complex in which Foucault, for one, located psychoanalysis and where he identified its most insidious disciplinary collusions. In the postcard, Derrida identifies this recursive looping structure as the transcendental tautology that defines the drivenness of the drive as such. The formalism of this tautology, its repetitive circular insistence, is the source of his deepest inventiveness and the very site of its engagement with the contingencies of history. I've been told to stop, so I will just stop here in 1 second. All this interminable stalling and stoppage might suggest that the prospects of change are bleak, and of course they are. But then again, it's only at moments of symbolic breakdown that history sheds its veneer as inexorable second nature. It's the experience of stuckness that forces us to reinvent the entire field, to take it again from the beginning, to go back to square one, to redefine the whole agenda. This is, of course, another way of understanding what Freud means by the death drive. I guess I'll stop.
Don't you think that this has to do with a specific image of God? If it's the God of one people, all the others can die. But if the God is the God of humanity, everybody are children of the same God, you cannot justify elimination. So you have another track toward elimination, another route, which is transformation from himself of the conscious. You transform from himself in order not to kill. So you eliminate the enemy by making it like you. So this is a strategy. I don't know what you think. Do you think that is a good interpretation?
Not of what I was saying. It's a good interpretation. This is why I pointed out this moment when Miriam and the Israelites and Moses, they're all singing the song of praise. Yahweh looks down and says, just remember the Egyptians were my creation too. So you already have a potential humanizing notion there. But the really interesting shift comes, for example, if you read in Schiller, this kind of negotiation, where he is trying to undermine this idea that freedom is for a select people, an oppressed to a free people, and that the rest have to go. But what you have also in the late 18th century is the emergence of always this dialectical pattern, which says that in order for freedom to come, something has to be put behind. And if it's a people, or it's a putting down of something else. And you get the perpetuation in dialectical argument of this old to new. And it can be the Old to the New Testament or the old to new ways of thinking. So you get this perpetuation, I think, of this, what I call a very divisive split that seems to be implicit in the concept. When you get into post-Second World War narratives, people start to say the only sense of freedom that matters here is if it is for all, not just for the selected some or the chosen some, but that comes much later, and it also doesn't come without violence. So that's what I would.
How theological do you think the concept of exodus is? In the sense that how tied or implicated to a kind of biblical theology? Can we think an exodus, can we say metaphorically, exodus from religion? Can we say that, or would be a contradiction or an impossibility? And to Rebecca, I very much like this ambivalence that you stressed, but I'm not certain whether it is the right one, because resistance, after all, has always an oppositional dimension. Resistance against change, resistance against continuity. So maybe this kind of ambivalence might in fact not be a true one, because what unifies all these different meanings is the against something. So, for example, this you find it even in the origins of the term stasis. Stasis means in order for me to engage in a conflict, I need to stand my ground. If I don't stand my ground, I'm not going to have a conflict. I might have to run away. And the question is to both of you: do you think exodus is a form of resistance or is a negation of resistance? For example, if I have to run because my oppressor is threatening me, I'm resisting, or I'm just a strategy of defeat? Or
Sure. In the answer to the last question, maybe I'll answer. Maybe Lydia will have a different answer. It depends. I mean, running away or leaving can be an act of resistance. I mean, and it can be a sticking of one's ground, even though mobility seems to be the more obvious aspect. If one's staying there represents a continuity of and filling a demand that is imposed by by the dominating forces. I mean, resistance doesn't have to be does not need to be a physical staying in place in order to maintain its fixity or its constancy.
But it's conflict in the sense of a kind of relational, oppositional conflict with someone.
Right. I mean, I would say leaving can be a way of prolonging the conflict. Did you want to take that up?
Yeah, that particular bit on my question.
I think that was for both of us.
Oh, okay. Just about the theological thing, it would be very easy for me to answer and say it of course started off as a combined concept from antiquity, mixed then with the Bible, overtaken by the Bible, and so on, and then you have this long history and it becomes more and more secular and taken over by kings and emperors. But I'm very taken by the recent literature that is, and this is what I'm doing in my own work at the moment, is looking at the constant theological underbelly of all these secular ideas. And so how theological is it becomes a complicated question. There's definitely there's a theological appeal at almost all moments, especially in the African American situation, in the African situation of Exodus. It's clearly theological. But then if you look in the Protestant Revolution in England, it becomes more secular and so on. So I would say that it's how theological is there's a concealed theology, even when it claims not to be theological. So I would go, I think, in that direction. And as for exodus and resistance, I think I would be inclined to become an Adornian for a moment, or even a Sartrean, and talk about the notion of whether one can really make an exit from anywhere. If you...
So go ahead,
Oh.
Never mind.
Yeah. The notion of...
Go ahead.
I mean, the Exodus is very pictorial and very powerful, of crossing a body of water, ending up somewhere new. But you also have Exodus, and I would say this too about the concept of resistance, where you're striving to turn over the conditions from inside. So it's this imminent resistance or imminent exodus. And that links to the notion of exodus as exile, when people talk about the exile as becoming an internal state. One lives as an exile in a situation of oppression, but you're not going anywhere. You're going into, and I think this was captured by the earlier question too. So I would tend to have a rather negative concept of resistance. I mean, one that doesn't seek a positive exit outside of something, but a kind of no exit, no exodus notion of resistance, or something like that.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank you both for this wonderfully complex, renditions of these topics. Great. I feel vindicated to have started the session with two brilliant women philosophers. I have questions for
There are
both.
two philosophers who happen to be
And you
women.
resisted it.
But I must say that.
I said you resisted it. You feel vindicated.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
there had to be something resisted.
Against convention, resisting against convention. That's certainly the case. Lydia, first of all, I have to say that when you mentioned the Walzer, this is I have to say this. It never would me out to think of Said's response and the fact that in many what named a legendary response was he named a canonized reading. In some ways, I think he performed a canonized reading, not in his way, obviously, but. My question, though, is based on the memory of another thinker who you invoked in any case. When you were talking about home in this, I thought of Adorno's phrase, home is the state of having escaped, which of course, is always read as a classic statement of exile, but it is also an exodus phrase. So the question would be, what would be the relation between the figure of exodus and the figure of exile, insofar as the figure of exile is in the exact opposite direction of the promised land. So that's the one thing. And Rebecca, this is in some ways an extension of Andreas. Independently, we oftentimes think alike about these things. But about the notion of stasis, which I think is a great thing to bring together resistance and stasis as you pointed out, it's actually even linguistically associative. But I would like to ask you to sort of meditate on what it might mean if we think of resistance as stasis in the context of psychoanalysis, which would of course implicate the analysis, and it would be a kind of internal conflict, and therefore the relation between the analyst and the analysant would actually be a civil strife. Those are my simple questions.
That's a lot of one. Let me just say, I knew that someone would ask me about Walzer and Said. I mean, you can't be.
Well, I'm not asking you. I just
No. But actually, I wanted to say something about the Said and Osman treatment of this matter of exodus, because it's pretty interesting, because I'm probably treading on a lot of toes now, but in my work on the history of the concept of Boheme, the Bohemians were called originally the Egyptians, and that's the origin of this history of the gypsies. And it's an incredibly interesting history, which is about wandering and dispersal, but never under the rubric of there being a people. So the Jews were allowed to be dispersed in exile as a people, maintaining law if they wanted, maintaining belief and so on. But when the gypsies or Egyptians were dispersed through biblical punishment, this was the dominant discourse till about 1787. And then it changed and became a discourse about Aryanism in India. That's a whole other story. But what's really interesting about this history of exile and exodus for Egyptians is that it had no promise of a promised land. It was an unpeopled sort of wandering. And what is really I found amazing in all the stuff I've been reading with Osman and Said and people in the history of Egyptology is that no mention is made of this history, as if this whole entire people called Egyptians were never part of the history. You only get the High Egypt and then an oppressed Egypt later on and so on, into the high Egyptology of early 19th century Europe. So you've got a whole history of exile that is associated with no promise, but only punishment. And that's the history of the gypsies. So I've been writing about this parallel history of dispersal of Jews and Egyptians, where one carries this promise, one carries this punishment, and then what happens around 1800 when the story changes. But I haven't found any of this in contemporary work on this Egyptology.
Yeah.
And I find, so it just happens to be extraordinary to me that it's a sort of, it's a black hole in these books. But I could go on and on about this, but maybe the thing about home, though, I just want to say, is Adorno introduces that very interesting notion, not of being homeless, but of being roofless, of the moment when there is no roof over your head, and what it then means to be at home in a place where there is no roof. And that notion of being at home when you're not at home and exile is contained in this beautiful paragraph. He actually stole it from Nietzsche, but it's very good, even in Minima Moralia. So that's what I would say. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded.
You asked me about how this this kind of aphoretic or contradictory notion of stasis plays out in psychoanalysis, which is kind of what I was trying to explore in the second part of the paper. I mean, one thing that I think this, if the longueur of psychoanalysis and the potential, what at the end of Freud's life will be the interminability of psychoanalysis, seems to involve, seems to imply this endless stasis whereby resistance, seems to be infinite, but also seems to be infinitely unproductive in the sense that it's unworking. I mean, it's impeding the work. The least productive way of understanding, the permanence of repetition, which is what I'm actually talking about, would be by way of some kind of pessimistic reading of the death drive as being all about some, evil demon within us, some dark force of aggression or some self-destructive thing hell-bent on, maintaining our own oppression and so on. But the turmoil of psychoanalysis, which is both an internal, which is both an endless movement and an endless, an apparent immobility, and this is the very position of psychoanalysis. I mean, this literal position into which psychoanalysis puts you is one of forced immobility. One thing that there's a stage, psychoanalysis is a stage of resistance in a way of an enactment of resistance. It will eventually, if all goes well, move beyond the simple dyadic binary imaginary model of resistance, which is so easily dissed, by way of antithetical slave, reproductive forms of resistance which play into the regime, because one of the, that imaginary set of relations between psychoanalyst and analysand is the very, that is the very thing that has to be overcome, but in the name of another kind of resistance. But the other thing that will be overcome is the seemingly do-it-yourself aspect of resistance. I mean, the psychoanalysis is needed, is brought in order to prove his own irrelevance or redundancy. I can do it myself. I'm good at it. I can, I can do my own interpreting and so on and so forth. Which is a kind of one-upmanship, which is, on the one hand, seems to be very bourgeois in one sense. It's about liberal self-care, but on the other hand, it's demanding this reinforcement, which points to an implicitly social stage at which resistance is actually always being played out. So the appearance of autonomy, the claims for autonomy are constantly undermining themselves. So that's these are some of the ways in which psychoanalysis, I think, the implications of full-bodied psychoanalysis that goes, that embraces the death drive as a fundamental premise are politically relevant to us today.
So I
simpler explanation, political explanation for the duality of resistance. Namely, resistance always occurs when revolution is impossible. So that the very nature, that's the Adorno Benjamin debate, right? Benjamin is always looking for the revolutionary moment. Adorno says revolution is impossible, all that's possible is resistance. Now, if resistance is the placeholder for revolution, which is how I understand the term politically, I take it that's Hegel's argument in his book, then it's going to follow that it's going to have those two sides. That is, it's necessarily going to be, as it were, the very thing that points to revolution, whose very character as revolution is about that absence and therefore feeds on that repetition. So it seems to me that, it's the political structure of resistance that gives it its dual structure and nothing to do with the death drive, right? I just want to say it's about the nature of the political itself.
Well, it's certainly on that reading it would be a counter-revolutionary, not simply a non-revolutionary concept, but a counter-revolutionary concept. If it is, and this is a very specific way of reading the Adorno Benjamin debate too, by the way, but if resistance is reduced to both the a placeholder for a revolution, which is never going to happen and never did happen, or well,
it's when it's impossible,
right?
We resist for the sake of revolution. And the question of the indeterminacy of interminable or terminable is in the condition itself.
I see. Not a placeholder in the sense of a substitute, a surrogate for, but holding open the place for a revolution to come. Yes, I think that is correct. I think that is completely compatible with this structure, with this structural repetition that psychoanalysis is so good at exposing and staging. And I think it's one way of understanding the interminability of psychoanalysis itself as a placeholder, if you like, for which is why psychoanalysis is not social work. It's not about making changes. It's about clearing the stage such that one can, such that change can take place. I think those are very analogous moves.
We have to take a few questions now because we are running out of time. So, Jeff.
Where's the finish? This is for Rebecca, really.
Light off that word.
I'm holding on to it.
It doesn't work.
I wanted to say a little bit more about the politics of resistance conceived under the aspect of the death drive. It's clearly not associated with the classic model of politics as autonomous action or organization around the tension or the corporate action that is a proxy for an individual conscious will toward a given end. So what would the possible politics of resistance be, or a possible politics of resistance be, when construed under the aspect of the death drive?
Okay, I'll do without the fetish. I'd like to ask, I thought the papers won't be together, but I wanted to ask Rebecca about her references to free and direct discourse, because it seemed to me in part, because there was a moment when, it seemed to me that there was a moment when you explicitly sort of registered your speaking in free and direct discourse, but in a way, the paper began in this fascinatingly free and direct discursive way when you talked about the paper that you might have given and then moved to the paper that you were giving. And so in a way there was this kind of free and direct reference to this other paper. And I was wondering if there's a moment when you stopped speaking in free and direct discourse. I mean, you were of course stopped from finishing, I don't know if you were stopped from finishing your paper, but there was certainly a moment when you were about to exit or exodus into the moment of, the moment when stuckness forces us to reinvent the field. So there was a threshold there that you were moving out of. Was that a moment when you were about to move out of free and direct discourse, or was that a moment when, or had you already moved out of it?
So I will create my own question.
I'm shocked.
In the story of Exodus, the biblical story of Exodus, God is playing a really important part.
I think so.
You forgot about it almost as the Haggadah forgets about Moses. God is the one who becomes the subjective power of the Israelites much before they got to the promised land. So Exodus is first of all about the transition from one power to another power, God. And then the story goes on. So there is always, between the dialectics that you described so beautifully, always has a third party. And I would like to hear more about this third party, because I don't want to be faithful to the Bible, but the structure itself keeps recurring on and on. And especially since the story is about resistance. Because from the second moment after, the first moment after crossing the sea, there is resistance. They don't want to go. So, and this is a resistance of the kind that more reactionary that Jay described. It's not just about a placeholder for revolution. It's about losing any political plan. Just doesn't having no alternative action. So there are.
Okay, maybe I'll take the two resistance questions in reverse order. I've got a fetish that works. So I just want to take this question of free and direct discourse first, because the answer is no. I don't think there was any exit or would have been an exit from that, even if I had to exit the paper in a less rushed fashion. So I know it sounded very assertive at the end, but that was just because I was up against a wall. And I mean, I think this is not a trivial point. I mean, I think the truth of psychoanalysis and the meaning, which also has to do with the perpetuity of resistance, actually, is that there is no exit from free and direct discourse. That we are always ventriloquizing, that we are always quoting, that we are always, in some sense, performing this repetitive speech act, even if it's one's own words that one is quoting and speaking freely and directly of and through and so on and so forth. And this seems to me have very direct or indirect political implications. It certainly has bearing on the question of voice and who, and the name in which one is acting, and the sort of singularity of the agent of the speech act, and the large speech act, which is any political act. So I would say no. There's no exit from it, but that doesn't seem to me problematic particularly. It seems to me one has to own that, and we'll see what you have to say about that. I actually can't quite remember what your question was about.
Just answered it.
Did I? Okay, well, just one quick add-on then. the infinity of resistance, psychoanalytically speaking, that is, say, the perpetuity of it, is also means that despite Freud's own militaristic vocabulary, resistance is not simply a resistance to the lifting of repression. And that means that it's not something that can be cleared away like a roadblock or dissipated like a mirage. This has everything to do with ideology and fetishism, by the way, because the model of consciousness raising or critical Aufklärung, and that means vanguardism and everything else that goes with that, loses its pertinence, psychoanalytically speaking, and therefore politically speaking. So the whole question of consciousness becomes revised.
Okay, so the Bible. Yes. You're quite right about the third power and the triangle, although in fact I did actually talk about it in my sentences in the following way. One of the deepest issues in the history of the Exodus concept is this very difficult negotiation in the biblical story between what Yahweh is up to and what Moses is up to. So there's Yahweh described as the maker of the law, of course, the creator of all things, and then Moses is simply the deliverer of the law. But then you start to get Moses in the discourse being described as the leader, as the Moses of the law, as though he had the authority. And when he gets to the Meribah rock and he strikes it in the wrong way and goes against Yahweh's instruction, this is a moment of decisive change in his life, and one of the reasons it's said that he has to die and won't get to the promised land. So you get this real negotiation between making and delivering divine law. And all the time, and then you have, of course, the resistance of the Israelites, both at the moment of reaching the Red Sea and when they get over, saying, okay, show us that this was worth it, and Moses going on and on trying to prepare these people for a freedom, then being resistant pretty much all the way through. They're a rowdy, rude bunch, apparently, and so on. You've got all the Schoenberg opera, which I know the best, but you've got the whole story of their resistance. But you also have this issue raised as a matter of, from the ancient term of hubris, because in a lot of biblical portrayals of the Pharaoh, he goes into the Red Sea and he puts its javelin up at God and says, it is me against you, not me against Moses, but me against you. And the Pharaoh says, you will never be godlike, you will never be a god, you cannot challenge my authority, and he gets out of the way. Moses doesn't ever claim to take on this divine status. This is a problem we get to in Christianity with this doubling of Jesus Christ business. That's another issue. But what I'm saying here is the role of divine power gets kept in the picture and taken out whenever people refigure Moses as actually the maker of the law, not the deliverer. And this is part of what people talk about as the either the secularizing or the humanizing of the Exodus narrative or the Exodus concept, so that it becomes, as I was stressing, this issue of preparing people to accept the law, acknowledging that people are through and through human. And when you get to that issue of preparation, that notion of divine promise gets somewhat underplayed. So I'm trying to I'm trying to focus on the sort of human, all too human part of the Exodus narrative, because it's, after all, humans who have to live in the wilderness.
Thank you. Thank you very much.